thanks for joining today. I'm really excited to go through this session with you today around build or buy a payment orchestration platform. Um, First, quick introduction to myself. So I'm Lochan Sim. I've been in payment acceptance for about 13 years. Spent my time across tech, product, sales, and product partnerships. With merchants, I've been spending my time trying to help them get their perfect payment set up. And then with platforms and shopping carts, helping them become payment and with some of them financial services companies. And really, I think the key piece I took out of those times that's relevant for today is just as the years went by, the number of companies that were picking multiple payment companies to be their in their setup, as opposed to going down that one provider route, just seemed to be growing from my perspective. And I think like when I started out 13 years ago, the concept was fairly standard of I'll take one provider for the US and one provider for Europe and one provider maybe in another country or territory that I operated in. And there wasn't really that concept in a mature world of I'll take two providers and kind of face them off to each other. Um, and I think like from my side, therefore, I kind of saw all of this rise of multiple providers, and there was just this huge gap that was left where merchants were left to kind of figure out like how they manage that kind of payment setup that they had. And I think so this for me was one of the big driving reasons as to why I wanted to enter the payment orchestration space. I was really lucky that I joined the leader in the space. And yeah, today we'll talk about the build or buy scenario, which is definitely the most common conversation I'm having now with all of our customers and merchants that we speak to. So today we'll talk about the history of kind of why we are where we are today and why it wasn't this case kind of 5-10 years ago. And I think the history is important because it has impacted the discussions and the decisions that have been made in these last 5 to 10 years, and we're still seeing the impact of those now. And so as you go through these discussions internally, having some of this context and background is really helpful to, one, align it to your company, and two, as you go through these discussions and business cases and so on, whatever the side of the decision you sit on, these snippets and this understanding is really helpful for yourself and for your colleagues to go through. We'll then progress on to kind of the aspects of what's included in a payment orchestration layer, whether you build or buy. And then we'll talk about kind of the future of that. What does it look like in 3-5 years' time? We talk about some of the things that you miss out on when you go down the build path. And then we talk about some of the realities that we've seen when you do go down the build path. But then we also kind of finish this topic off on a case study, and then also when is build the right, when is buy the right, and also raise this question of like, is there a hybrid that's in the middle that allows you to take advantage of both? And then we close out, and of course, like with my contact details, you can feel free to ask me any questions as well after this session. Yeah, so without further ado, kind of let's kick off. And as I say, like I think one of the most important things for us is like explaining the history of like why orchestration is like coming off and kicking up in 2020, and why didn't it come around 2015 or 2010 or any of the other years. And really, I think like we've listed out a few of the reasons here that we think were like real deal breakers that meant this industry couldn't have even existed like in any real sense. And why, as this trends continue, you can start to grasp that actually this looks like the tipping point. This looks like that hockey stick growth in terms of the prevalence of orchestration instead of the build and building it in-house route. And I'll take the first one, right? This is one of my favorite favorite points was around the on-premise versus the cloud. Like 10 years ago, on-premise was certainly a lot more common then than it is now, and cloud was still in its infancy. And you can imagine as a startup, we would have two choices, right? We would either kind of build a data center and go out there and try and pitch our data center as the place to route your traffic through. As a startup, I think that's a very hard pitch in terms of rocking up. Like you could imagine we get on a plane with the founders, we fly over to San Francisco and Palo Alto to pitch to the tech companies to say, hey, we want to be your orchestration layer. And then kind of it falls down when our data center would most likely be in Munich because that's where we're based. And you can't really sell your startup's data center to a large global brand. The other side of that, right, you could increase the chances of the startup and you could say, hey, well, we could go out and build a bunch of data centers alongside building out our orchestration layer. And that's just not realistic, right? It's not the way you can build a business. And then the last thing is the alternative would have been we could have provided a CD with some code and merchants could have run it on an on-premise on themselves. Either of these, right, they're time sensitive in terms of like their lifespan, but this really was a blocker for us. Without the cloud, like orchestration doesn't really exist. And I think like lack of trust in the cloud is also a key one, because when you get to that point where like we've gone from time where like cloud really didn't have much trust, and then some people and some verticals and some industries picked it up and some geos quicker than others, which has been really good to see. And I think now we're getting to that level where there's obviously a lot more trust in that space. But like even from our point of view, let's put us back in that room in like Palo Alto, and we're pitching to one of the tech companies to say we could do your global processing. As a startup, we're going to have our data center. We would hopefully have a redundancy data center, but it's like if that fails, right, it's just not there. And if we went in with the cloud, a single cloud, where we've seen time and again that some of the clouds go down, and it's only really recently that we've been able to take advantage of cross-cloud. So like, for instance, we're across Amazon, Google, and Microsoft across the globe. But that's a recent initiative, right? And again, like 10 years ago, that couldn't have happened. And I touched on it earlier as you drop down that list of like, there's been no truly global payment providers, say 10 years ago. And that put you into that logic to say, hey, I'm a business, I sell in the US and I sell to EMEA. I'll take one in the US and I'll take one provider into EMEA. And the concept of that A/B testing for acceptance or cost or playing off each other for the roadmaps, like that didn't really exist because there wasn't the chance to do that. Whereas if now you look at it, there's a good number of really strong global providers. And then there's also this other tier that's coming up, which is regional providers. Like you look at Latin America, the rise in quality providers in Latin America is phenomenal. Similar things are happening in Africa. Similar things are happening in India and a whole bunch of other markets. So now the decision is a lot more difficult because there's a lot more providers to choose from. But on the flip side, as a payments lead, you've got that opportunity to say, hey, if I play this right, and I do take an orchestration in-house or built, I can now start to actually play these providers off each other so that I get the best service for me and my customers and my business. That's something, again, that's fairly recent, right? It's not something that's been around even 5 years at a high level. Dropping down one further, like when you look at the use of AI and ML in payments, like this whole like buzzword bingo, I guess, but like, again, this concept of if I was a brand and I was looking to see who gives me the best acceptance rate in North America or across Europe, like what was fairly common was like you would bounce acquirers off of each other and say, if it declined here, I'll try here. And if it declined here, I'll try here. But like the concept of where we are now, which is like real smart intelligence that says, well, this issuer wants this type of authorization request. This issuer wants this type of authorization request. Like there's real intelligence in the products. And this intelligence is what is also driving the need to orchestrate, because as brands, you need to take advantage of this. And if provider A develops some really good intelligence and provider B, you shouldn't have to pick between the two. You shouldn't have to say, well, I have to give all my traffic to one. You should be able to say, hey, if they're making smart products, then I want to take advantage of both their smart products and see which one's the best for me. Because the industry is moving so fast, who knows what that's going to look like in 12 months, 24 months. And if you've locked yourself in for 3 years, you can't keep up with all of this change. Dropping down one more, right, to the fraud tools. I think from my experience, it was fairly common that you'd see merchants take the fraud tool included in with the payment company that they were purchasing from. And I think whereas now you look at that model where you've got the likes of Ravlin and Forta and Riskified and Signified and Sift, and there's so many more quality names out there that, again, like back in the day when it was just like, I'll send my fraud to the same payment provider, the integration's fairly straightforward for that. But when you're now in this world of, hang on a moment, I want to take provider A as a fraud tool across all my traffic because they're really good, but then actually I want to take advantage on some of certain transactions from those chargeback liability providers that are in the fraud space. Like all of a sudden you've started to get into the concept of orchestration with just fraud, let alone payments. And I think like that's where things start to get like really, again, complex or interesting, depending on which side of the table you're on. And it's like that element of orchestration again is like, there's a lot of brands out there saying now, like, why do I have to build that logic? Why do I have to maintain that? That's heavy effort on my side. Again, I would like to push that out to a SaaS company who's just going to do it for me because it's fairly standard. What is applicable to me is just the logic of which particular transactions. Dropping down to the last point, where we were before, like from, again, my experience, a lot of the interaction that we had was engineers, software engineers who were doing the integrations to payment companies because they were fairly like straightforward, right? You didn't have too much orchestration. You didn't have 3DS2 everywhere or 3DS. You didn't have the concept of account updater and network tokens and these advanced fraud tools with the JavaScript. You didn't have all of these like complexities. And some of those payment integrations back in the day were like fairly straightforward. So you could have this concept of software engineers, like with some experience, could do the integration to a payments company. Whereas I think like now you're at this place where software engineers have actually gone further and you've now got these specialists of payment engineers or payment software engineers, and they're in high demand because of a number of companies built their software. Like Uber's a great example. There's others that are out there. Zalando's public about their payments team. And therefore, these engineers are specialists in their field, and there's not enough of them. And that puts them in high demand. It means that they're expensive because they have a great negotiation power. And therefore, businesses are saying, like, hang on a minute, like if it's hard to find payment engineers and I've got this huge backlog of things, like when I do get my hands on payment engineers, like I want them on the most valuable topics possible. I don't think I want them on the basic side. I don't want them on the table stakes. And I think like that's again another piece that says, hang on a second, can I get this completed by a SaaS company who's just going to charge me a small fee versus like the cost that I would get as employing a team or even a bigger team. And so like I think like a lot of what's come out of here is history has forced brands to go down the build path. But as we like transition over to this, you have to build so much that it really does become like quite a big beast. And I think 10 years ago or so, like sticking with the history theme, the effort that went into this meant that there wouldn't be so many boxes on this page. But as time goes by, you're definitely getting more boxes just because of the way payments is evolving, because of the rate of technology change. And just to like build this out, like many of you will have seen a layer like this. Many of you will have a layer like this or a diagram like this in your business. But like just to explain some of this, so the e-commerce layer is the storefronts. So that could be different geos or different sites for different geos. It could be different channels. So it could be the store, the app, or the online. Could be the call center, any way where you'd integrate that payments application. And then you've got the payment platform layer, which is all of the components that go inside that payment platform, whether you build or buy it, just depends who's building it. Then you've got the external payment services layer, which is those third parties that you connect to that are performing a function that isn't related to the processing of the payment, but again, you don't do it yourself. So an example of these would be that chargeback defense tool. There's a number of providers that offer that. And they help you with that service. Obviously needs a connection into the payments layer. And then the last one, obviously this mix varies per customer and per merchant, but here you'd see like multiple providers across payment, fraud, payment methods, and then even like gift cards and things like that. And I think, as you say, like we go through this, like each box becomes a standalone product. So each one of these will have its backlog of features, its roadmap. Each one is going to take some effort to research, like what's the vision of that product? Where should it go? Like it's going to have its own security assessments. It's going to have its own monitoring and maintenance. And I think like if you just pull out one of these as an example, right? 10 years ago, particularly in North America, it's fairly common that you would have the payment page would collect the raw card details. PCI comes along, or PCI DSS comes along, and off we go. We come off of that. And we move now into a hosted payment page or a client-side encryption. And that's a change, right? You had to make that change to your pages. It's fairly substantial in some cases. And now you look at that and we're looking at hosted fields. And after hosted fields, we'll have the next step. But before we get off that next step, we've now got like what's come along as well that impacts the payment page is tokenization. We've got 3DS. We've got more payment methods. We've got a whole bunch more things. And I think like 10 years ago, you wouldn't have had such quality field validation. Now you've got fantastic field validation. And the point here really is like each of these boxes like grows in size every year that goes by. And ultimately, it will also have a whole end of life product life cycle in here as well. So you have to decide when to kill the product and rebuild it. You'll have to kill the product because it might not be used. And this is just a lot of maintenance and overhead that then an operational expenditure on your business. And again, like if you're set up for that, then I definitely understand why it's there and exists. The question really becomes is like, who looks after this? Is it in-house, or do you take this table stakes from the outsourced company? And the last thing I say, like kind of touched on it earlier, is that the more boxes will appear. So as technology improves and evolves, and as more of the world comes online, and as more of the world becomes accessible for others to sell to, and as more as like payments just becomes more and more detailed and dark depth, so deeper depths of its functionality, but also like we're already seeing the linking between payments and loyalty. And I think like all of this is going to explode in terms of more connectivity, more integrations. And again, it's that focus on, do you build it or do you buy it? Moving on that topic, it then kind of the last bit, which I think for me, this is one of the most important discussions that I have when I'm talking to these merchants. But it's also, I accept fully that this is one of those hardest to quantify like components or two assessment areas of the build or buy strategy. And it really helps. It's more of a philosophical point, I think, around like, where does the leadership team, where do you as the payments lead want this to be? And I think like those two benefits, like to drill into them a little bit, like the first one around performance benchmarking. If you decide to build things yourselves, it's really hard to benchmark with your peers because it's your technology. It's typically fairly like private. There's not much exposure out there in terms of like, what are your response times like? What's your uptime like? What's your downtime like? What's your best security standards? I think we're still fairly like young or infant in terms of the payment community of sharing how it really works. And then you've also got like the performance of transactions. And I think it takes a lot of onus on yourself to then go out to the community and the network and really try your hardest to benchmark. But you certainly would find it really hard to get data feeds in to say like, hey, we think this is not performing as expected because we've seen it elsewhere. Like that's a really hard thing to do when you build it yourself because you don't have access to that data from other merchants. And it's always going to be hard to put a proof point on that, right? Like we've seen customers of ours like uncover a new retry strategy or a routing logic, and they're more than happy to share it. But like, will they invest the time to go out and share it themselves at a conference and build their own network? That doesn't always happen for many a reason. But us as the platform that we enable that, then therefore we're able to share that with our other customers without them having to do anything. And I think it's a philosophical point because it's really difficult to calculate. Similar to that on the shared product roadmap, like this one with transparency has two sides, right? You have the when you're building, you own your roadmap, so you are free to decide where everything goes in terms of that and priority, in terms of like how big that roadmap or the backlog is, how much resource goes into it. When you buy, you don't have that emphasis all the time, and that has pros and cons. But on the pro side of things, like a lot of this happens around like, I think a great one is sticking with the retry logic is we see so many times with customers where they're like, we want the latest retry logic, but if they've built in-house, where do they get that knowledge from? Like they have to network themselves. They have to read. They have to go out to their colleagues that are in the industry. They have to absorb it from the payment companies. And I think this is best summed up by like, if that's a payments team, they have their network. Now compare that to a software platform that is connected to 100 plus of the providers to absorb all 100 of their knowledge. Then you've got like the schemes with the connections to them. And then on top of that, you've got all of the merchants that are on the platform. That shared pool of knowledge, but then also product features suddenly becomes really interesting, I think, when you start to compare, hey, I want to do retry version 2 for my platform. Like, is it going to be quicker, and is it going to be a stronger ROI on build or buy? Obviously, it's a like a very, very personal like question and subjective to each merchant. But the again, the philosophical approach would suggest that there should be a number of benefits that come from the right platform that you buy, that actually those products and those features just get delivered to you as you would expect as the feature and the platform evolves. So you're actually not having to spend that effort going out and building Retry Logic version 2. You're consuming that as another feature that comes out every week or every month or every fortnight from the platform that you've purchased. So there's definitely two sides, but it is beneficial in multiple occasions. And then this touches on it as well, right? The concept here is like, I think from the discussions that we've had, our leadership team, myself, the number of merchants that we've got and the number of merchants that we've spoken to, it seems to follow a pattern of about 85% of resources go towards the development that every company is doing in a similar sense. And like the background behind this is like when you go out and set out that decision of build or buy, you might have, say, a hypothetical 50 features that you're making an assessment against. And you're saying 50 features, I can do this. We're going to build. Okay. And then just as the project slips, you're now kind of putting in doubt your go live date, and certainly in some of the larger companies, projects do slip, or it might be stuck in the approval or sign off or the resourcing of finding the payment engineers. So you might cut a couple of features so to ensure that you remain on time. And as the project continues, it's the first time you're building with the new team, so therefore you cut another couple of projects. And then again, hypothetical example, you might be down to 40 or so features that are on there. And then even within that 40, what we often see is like, let's say you set out to say, we want to build the best retry logic. What typically seems to happen is that really gets cut on V1 of the launch. And then you're fighting back to the business case to get resource to go and make V2, V3, V4. And it's really hard to watch that. And I think like our point here is like with these discussions, we've got some of this experience where we can start to pinpoint and play the kind of the sounding board in terms of what really happens when we see these payment platforms being built in-house. And like looking at the slide, right, there's kind of 85% of these features are just common features that are built, like building the integration to the PSP, building the retry or the error handling, doing the credentials management, doing the security, doing the hosting, doing the analytics and the business intelligence to make sure the monitoring's there. And then you've got the routing topic, like let's make sure the cascading logic's there. Again, how do you handle errors? All of this stuff is like, it's really not that specific to each and every business. And therefore it's just repeatable. So like if you go down that path and do it, and company X does it too, and company Y, you're kind of doing the same job. And what you're not getting is much time to do the 15% of the bespoke work. And it's the bespoke stuff that is like, I think everyone's dream, right? Like that's the stuff that we want to do. And case in point here, I think like I was talking to a company that offers loyalty points, and you can use those loyalty points to discount the purchase price. The reason that loyalty program was invented was really to help reduce the interchange costs that they were paying. If you can reduce the ticket price, then you reduce your interchange costs. But that project was stuck in like the get-go because it has such an impact on the payments layer and the routing and just a number of the connections that they really didn't get to offer what they wanted to offer because they were having to build the basics, the token vault, the retry logic at a kind of basic level, the security, the hosting. And on the flip side, when you go out to the customers that are actually gone and just buy the platform, they don't have to deal with some of this like mundane table stake stuff, and they do get the chance to focus on more on the bespoke activities. And I think like this is one of the most frustrating discussions that we have, I think, from our side, is just like watching that happen and just like watching this process like unfold. And we do our absolute best at the beginning. And this is why, as I say from the very beginning, like we're very confident in the mission of our company, with the product vision of where it's going, that we really do just want to make sure that we try to help people be as informed as possible and really understand the decisions that they're going to take, but also like what can happen post that decision and how it can impact actually what you're going out to select. That's definitely something that we try our best to do, and we're always here for a conversation. And then touching on that, like to this point, as a case study. And as we go through this study, the real point that I want to put out is like these are real numbers. You can see that the orange of make is significantly more expensive than the pink line of buy. We can't reveal the figures because this is a real life customer, but it talks to the point of Dan Kingfisher, a plus $10 billion merchant headquartered in the UK. Like, they're just not a payments company. They don't have that experience. They don't know how to go and do this. They went down that buy route and transitioned from kind of a form of built. And I think what's really important though is this isn't always the curve, right? Like, this curve is very much in favor of the buy from a finance point of view. And it's representative of just the technical effort that's involved in creating a payments layer. But it isn't always this case, right? Like, I've been in a number of meetings and workshops where ultimately the graph turns out where the orange and the pink line are a lot closer together. We've even been in some where actually, like, the pink line is above the orange line. I think the point I really want to make is that each graph is specific to yourself. And I think what we've done is a really good job in terms of really trying to uncover with merchants, like, what is the true cost? Like, what costs should I put in? What should those costs be? And then by the sheer nature of us having done a number of these now and spoken and been around for a while, and also from the background of where our company like leadership has come from, we also have a really good understanding of just like what's a benchmark as well. So like when you go out and suggest that a cost of security is going to be X, like we can also understand like, what does that sit what we've seen from other companies as well. And again, the ultimate aim here is just to help you make sure you make the right decision for your business. And it's always going to take time. It's always going to be a really deep dive, but it's a great process to go through. I think the longer you look at it from like years 2, 3, 4, 5, actually that's when it really becomes like super interesting from a payments person's or payment lead or payment owner's role, because that's when you start to look at really the dream. That's when the investment pays off. That's when you're really like nailing some of the value that you're bringing. And that really touches like on this slide, right, where we talk about where it is the right option. I think as we go through these discussions with merchants, and we had this discussion just this morning around like the build or buy scenario with one of our customers and one of our merchants. And like when you look on the left-hand side, you've got kind of this sliding scale of your current payment setup. And on the right-hand side, you've got the payments team or the payments owner dream. And this is what we see as common, right? This is as close as we can get to if you're this type of business, build might be better than buy or vice versa. And really what we ask customers, so merchants, to do in our discussions, and we help them with this, is really understand what's achievable with the build model that you've got. And like, how can you get there? And if there's a big, or if there's a small delta between the payments team dream and the achievable with build, like build is definitely a great option to deep dive into. Like when you consider kind of Uber's fairly public about what they do with their payments model. LinkedIn's also released some of theirs. Like when you look at that dream and you see how much they're investing, you see how much work's going into it, you can start to picture that what's achievable is actually fairly close to the dream. And I think that's awesome, right? When you get to do that, like it's amazing. But that's not always the case, right? I know many a payments team, some of my friends that are there, they have their current payment setup, and then you have their dream of where they want it to go and where they know it can go if they had the resource and they had the budget to go for it. But the achievable with building is way too far to the left. And therefore, what actually could be the best option is what's achievable with the buy model. Because when you buy, you get all of that table stakes that I was talking about earlier. It's included. And therefore, what you really get to do is start to look at that value add and how do you link payments to loyalty? How do you build a fantastic routing logic? How do you build the best retry logic for your customers? How do you get to the geos that you wanted to get to but you couldn't do? How do you optimize that payment page without having to go back to the product team and build a whole business case around it, how do you like not have to face that challenge of, well, if it isn't going to bring us $500,000 in net income this year, which just doesn't make the payments backlog? How do you like, you don't have to deal with that 18-month backlog so much that you've got, and all of a sudden you're freeing up your resources to do the more valuable things that get you to that dream. And I think the best thing about the role that I have is you get to the dream bit, and when you start to take away a lot of the table stakes, like you get to have the discussions where actually the dream can be pushed and you can push it further to the right, which is why we always put the payments team dream on the buys quite often is pushed further right than the dream that's with the build, because you're not having to worry about the table stakes. You've got more mental capacity to go actually and think about what's possible. And I think that's where it's really good. And I think it's always hard. I think it's very difficult to say, well, you're in this vertical or this size, or you've got this many adapters, and therefore you should build or you should buy. It's a really difficult conversation where I've got a strong tech org who have the engineers sit next to them in the office and the CEOs there, so they always get funded. It's really difficult, and that's really hard to kind of predict. However, kind of this achievable to buy or achievable to build is something that we see is like, so far for us, it's been the most fruitful with the customers and helping them understand which side of the table they should go to. And then the last thing kind of from my side is I talk a lot about the consultancy and the conversations that we have with our customers and these merchants. And I touched on it at the beginning about the belief that we have in our vision and our product vision. And this is our point. Our main piece here is that we want to help our customers and our merchants make the right decision on build or buy. And you can see on the slide, there's a number of activities that we do that try to help customers on that path. The other thing I want to raise, which I touched on at the very beginning, is like that it doesn't have to be build or buy. This isn't 100% this or 100% that or an either or. We are looking, and I think probably the most exciting piece of the discussions I have with customers is around this concept of a hybrid, where actually if you've already built a lot of this infrastructure or you're already on that path, like you don't want to rip it out. It might still work, and if there's no reason to rip it out, then how do we utilize the asset that you've built? How do we build value into that? And I think like a great example of that that we were having a discussion with earlier in the year, or earlier in December, is around like a customer that we were working with. They'd already built the integrations and the routing to which providers, and they were happy with that. They were okay. They didn't want to rock that boat. However, what they didn't know was what was the best retry logic. They didn't have that intelligence in-house. They knew that they didn't. They had great intelligence, but they knew it could be better. And they didn't have the product really to do that. And their backlog was just a 12-month backlog. And that's after you've gone through the business case, after you've raised the vision. And so therefore, what we're talking to them about is just the kind of microservicing, for want of a better buzzword, of services, so that you can start to hybrid model your build or buy decision. And with that, I leave you. I say thank you for listening. My contact details are there, so if you have any questions at all, then please do not hesitate to get in touch. Would love having these discussions around build or buy. I think it's a fantastic topic. We're going to have a ton more content coming out on this. And yeah, would love to discuss this with you more. Thank you again.